just want to say thank you for joining us today. Next, we're going to be doing a land acknowledgement. And each time we do these land acknowledgements, I really want you to think about the words that we're saying, and not only the importance to a land conservation charity, but also the importance to you as someone who lives on this land and other people that live on this land and benefit from it. So we would like to start by acknowledging that we are on the traditional territories of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Lenape peoples, whose presence here continues to this day. We would also like to acknowledge that the land we are on is at the meeting place of two treaties, the lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit and those of the First Nations of the Williams Treaties. We thank them and other Indigenous peoples for sharing this land with us. We would also like to acknowledge the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation as our closest Indigenous community. We acknowledge this land and the people because the first step to reconciliation is recognizing the existence of Indigenous people. A shared understanding of how our collective past brought us to where we are today will help us walk together into a better future. We give deep gratitude to the Indigenous peoples of these lands who have been stewards of this land since time immemorial. The Oak Ridges Moraine Land Trust endeavors to honor the land and its treaties by strengthening our relationship and responsibilities to them. And even though I'm reading this land acknowledgement, these are words that we have thought of with such care. And we are so excited to continue these relationships with Indigenous peoples. We have learned so much from collaborating with them, and we hope to do so in the future. Now, a bit about the Oak Ridges Moraine. It's located within the Greenbelt, which not everybody knows. So it is protected under the Greenbelt. It is environmentally sensitive, and it's 160 kilometers long. So I'll show you a map in a moment. But because it is the moraine, it has a lot of different habitats that are really important, especially because it is located in a high development area. So this is the map. As you can see, it is longer than it is, wider than it is tall. So it's 160 kilometers wide. At some areas, it's just a few kilometers thin. And all those dots are properties that we actually take care of. So either we own them, or we have a conservation agreement, or it's a joint ownership between two organizations. Again, it's important because the moraine's aquifer system supplies drinking water for over 250,000 people, and it's habitat to critical species at risk, which is especially important in Southern Ontario, where there's a lot of them, but there is a lot of threats as well. So as a land trust, we protect land in many different ways. We don't own all of the land we protect, but we do have, as I mentioned, conservation easements and covenants and all this other legal jargon. But basically, we protect 4,400 acres of land, and every single year, typically that's going to increase thanks to people who are donating land to us or donating funds to us. We also support climate change resilience. We support species at risk, of course, and we help you connect to your land. One of the ways that we do acquire land is through the Ecological Gifts program, which is really fantastic for landowners. You end up getting significant tax benefits, and it saves biodiversity in the long run. If you want to learn any more about that, definitely just reach out to us. And we also want you to get involved. We are a very social group. We're a small group, and we need a lot of help. So you can become a member, you can donate, you can volunteer, and you can join our events like this one. Specifically, we really need volunteers for October 2nd and 3rd. We are doing a fantastic planting event in Schomberg, Ontario. And we're looking to restore two nature reserves. We're doing a pollinator garden, and we also did a prescribed burn that needs some grassland plants. So please reach out to us if you're interested in that. And then our next two webinars are about trees and about winter birds. All right, and now I'm happy to welcome Dr. Sheila Colla. So she has a PhD in biology, and you can read some of the rest, but basically she has a fantastic resume dealing with at-risk pollinators. And she is currently an assistant professor at York University. So we're very excited to have her. And with that, I'm going to be handing it off. Let me just stop sharing my screen. Oh, and sorry, I should mention that any questions you have for Sheila, please put in the Q&A box as opposed to the chat box, because using the chat box means that we might miss out on your questions, whereas the Q&A box, it'll all be nice and neat. So thank you. And Sheila, it's all yours.
Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming and joining us. I'm going to actually turn off my camera. So weird to like be giving a presentation and not show my face, but I do want to make sure that there's no issues with the internet bandwidth. So I'll turn off my camera in a second here. But yeah, so thanks so much for inviting me and for coming. And I'll talk to you about native bees and how you all can help. And if there's any issues, I won't be able to see the chat, so just interrupt me, no worries. All right, so you've heard a lot about insect declines. There was a study published in 2017 that was a very worrisome study. It was done in Germany, and it specifically looked at protected areas in Germany. And they had long-term data set about 30 years back. And they found that insect abundance had declined by over 75%. So this was a really large decline and very worrisome because generally people take insects for granted. There's not a lot of people, well, now there's a little bit more in terms of people studying bee declines and that kind of thing, but definitely insects we've kind of taken for granted because they're so small and they just seem like they're everywhere. So that study was a really highly shared study. Let's see here, I'm having issues with my slides. And I have a cough, so there's lots going on here. So insects provide a whole bunch of ecosystem services. You're all here because you want to learn about pollinators. I'm probably speaking to people who are pretty knowledgeable about this, but in case you aren't, pollinators, so 3/4 of our plants require some sort of animal pollination or benefit from animal pollination. So flowers have evolved to do all sorts of things to attract animals to visit them. Most often, they produce nectar to attract different animals like bees, and that animal goes in. And while it's drinking the nectar, it also gets covered in pollen, and then it visits a plant of the same species, drops off the pollen, and that's how we get a lot of our fruits and seeds. So these are some pictures from National Geographic, and it shows pollination in action. So often people talk about butterflies as pollinators, but they're actually pretty bad pollinators if you're thinking about pollen grains move from flower to flower. And this picture kind of shows why. They don't really have a lot of places for pollen grains to stick. So you'll see here that like maybe on the ends of the legs there, on the proboscis, there's a few pollen grains sticking, but it's not the kind of pollination that you might see for other insects. So this is a beetle, and you can see the pollen grains on its body. People don't think of beetles as pollinators, but we're pretty sure that they are effective at moving pollen around for certain plants. This is a mosquito. You're all familiar with female mosquitoes that drink our blood for protein to be able to produce eggs. Male mosquitoes do drink nectar from flowers, and you can see this mosquito has a pollinia from an orchid. So they do pollinate some flowers. This is a beloved plant, the cocoa flower. And cocoa plants are best pollinated by these non-biting midges, those tiny little things that, cloud around at the end of the summer that everyone kind of gets annoyed about. But so these types of flies are actually really important pollinators for all of our chocolate. So I'll be talking more about bees, but this is a picture of a sweat bee. And some species of bees do something called buzz pollination, which is what this bee is doing. So it uses its mandibles to grab onto this flower. In this case, it's a tomato flower. So tomatoes require buzz pollination. And only when it does this and vibrates at a certain frequency does the plant release the pollen. And you can see it releases it in a way that just covers the bee. And some plants require this kind of sonication in order to be properly pollinated. So I'm a conservation biologist, and I know you all know that when we are trying to conserve species, we need to learn about them. We need to know what they feed off of, where they live, where they move, where they mate, all sorts of things. And this is pretty obvious when you think about things like caribou. Some live in the boreal, some live in sort of more open areas, some live in large groups, some migrate, some don't. For orca whales, they have all these sort of migration routes that are really important when we're talking about like planning ship routes and that kind of thing, all sorts of stuff. So this is not something that's surprising, but it is interesting to think that with all of the different pollinator and bee species that we have, people don't take into consideration that we actually need to learn more about the individual species to be able to protect them. When you Google something like bee declines, you get all sorts of alarmist stuff and really sort of narrow points of view. So you get a lot of stuff about honeybees, which are essentially livestock. They're managed species that I'll get into a little bit more. You get a lot of stuff around pesticides, which are particularly problematic for honeybees, which are brought into agricultural lands. You'll get some stuff about bumblebees. You'll even get some pictures of flies, and you'll definitely get some alarmist stuff about all of us dying if the bees die. So one of the most difficult things that I've had to deal with as a pollinator conservationist, focus on declining species, is the fact that North America's favorite pollinator seems to be the European honeybee, which is very confusing. So they're non-native to this continent. They are invasive in many parts of the world, including the US. We don't have a lot of feral colonies in Southern Ontario now, ever since the Burrow mite kind of went through, but they are invasive in many parts of the world, and they do kind of swarm out and colonize places. They're very competitive. They can communicate with each other with the waggle dance, which is super cool. That means that they can tell their colonies of like 60,000 individuals, or however many are actually just doing foraging that day, where there's a good place for forage. They can tell each other, and then they can all go and extract that nectar and pollen. As far as we know, our native bees don't really communicate in that way, and none of our native bees have colonies that large. They have really high levels of disease. It's almost 100%, whether you're talking about Burrow mite, there's foul brood, there's literally over 100 different diseases that honeybee hives can have. And most hives have, the vast majority of hives have at least one of them. A lot of the times beekeepers are just managing for these diseases and they're not really caring for them. There's a lot of variation in beekeeper ability and capacity. So some beekeepers are out there every day, making sure their hives are fine, medicating them if needed, dealing with outbreaks, that kind of thing. But then you also have people who now put them on roofs or in their backyard, and they think they're just kind of helping, and they don't really go and check on them that often. And this is very problematic when we're talking about disease outbreaks, especially since we know that some diseases can go to other bees and other insects like flies. And by any metric that we look at that's accepted by the literature, honeybees are not at risk of extinction. In fact, in many places of the world, there's many more of them now than there was, say, 10 or 20 years ago. So it's been interesting to be a pollinator conservation, because all of a sudden this subject that I was working on became really popular amongst the public. So this is a Facebook on the right here, a Facebook question by the National Geographic, and it says, if you could dedicate your life to saving one species, what would you choose? And out of 14,000 responses, the bee was the most, or the winner. So when I was a teenager or whatever, people probably would have worried about, say, being elephants or tigers or great white sharks, or I don't know, some of these more charismatic things. So the fact that a bee, whatever that means, won is actually really, really interesting to me, and it explains a lot, as I'll get into in a second. So this public support has been amazing for us. We started a phone app or website called Bumble Bee Watch, which I'll also talk about in a bit. And it's been great. We've had so many people help us locate rare species and track common species and that kind of thing. And we're learning a lot. So that's been really good. And the other thing is we get a lot of media coverage. So some of it is a bit alarmist, or sometimes the headlines don't really match the actual stories. But it's been fun to be able to get our stories out there. So in Ontario, when Kathleen Wynne came into government, one of the first things she did was put together this pollinator action plan. And it ended up being the most commented on environmental item in over 20 years, since the existence of the Environmental Bill of Rights Registry, really. I got 52,000 comments. And the same week that she released this, she also released her climate change plan, which only got 500 comments. So that's really striking as someone who's in conservation for me, because climate change is very related to pollinator declines and not separate, and people should care about both of them. Maybe even care about climate change more than this bee action plan, actually, if I had to choose one. But anyway, it just really showed me that this is something that people are very, very interested in, passionate about. So I had a master's student, Allison Nichols, who's here on this picture here, go through the comments that people wrote in when they were commenting on this through the Environmental Bill of Rights Registry. Most of the comments, 90% of them, were those things you get in your email that just says, like, click here and we'll send a message for you, that kind of thing. But she went through and actually just tried to figure out from people who actually wrote in what the situation was, why people felt so strongly about this issue. The vast majority of the comments written in were in support of the proposal. So they wanted action to protect pollinators. And the focus of the plan was really on neonicotinoids. And what Allison found was that of these letters that people were writing in, only a third of them were citing evidence, but even then, it was only a third of the total comments. And often their stances were anecdotal, like they were saying how they just see less bees in their yard, that kind of thing, or they cited media articles. And overall, from like the 52,000 comments or whatever, only 8 comments referred to any peer-reviewed science. So that lets us know that the people commenting on policy are not really basing it on the best available science. In terms of what concerns people had, people were really concerned about bees and pollination. Those are the main things. We thought maybe there were some issues around like human health and pesticide use or what have you. But really people seem to be most interested in conserving bees and the pollination services they provide. In terms of what type of bees people are talking about, we really don't know. 3/4 just wrote the word bees. And then over 20% either said honeybees or implied honey by talking about wax or honey. And then just over 5% mentioned any other type of bee. So in Ontario, we actually have over 400 different species of bees, native species of bees. So this plan that really focused on a species that is not even native and doesn't even need protecting was very a challenging one to try to get people to wrap their heads around. And what ended up happening was, with all of this commentary and similar discussions in the US, any sort of pollinator action or pollinator protection policy that came through did end up reflecting a lot of this misinformation that people had around the situation with bee declines. So they focused mostly on honeybees, they focused mostly on monarchs. There was the Ontario one really did focus on neonic reduction, but really specific to cornfields. And in the end, the lobbyists kind of won, and the language was watered down to something like an aspirational reduction target. So there was no kind of enforcement or like real target. It was all aspirational. So yeah, it was really interesting to see something that I've been working so hard on for so many years, and what the policy kind of looked like after all of it. So to kind of understand what the public understanding was, we did, with Friends of the Earth Canada, a national survey. And the results were not surprising, but almost half of Canadians think that all bees are endangered. So in Canada, we have 865 or so species of bees. More than half of Canadians thought the European honeybee is a wild and native bee, and 2/3 were unsure if honeybees could replace native bees. Only one person of the 2,000 that we surveyed was able to name a solitary bee, and the vast majority of people believe that pesticide use and the loss of flowers were the most important threats to bees, which is not the case. So in terms of why we need to think about wild bees, there's a few reasons, and some of them you might already know about, but for agriculture, for pollination, often farmers will bring in honeybees as kind of like an insurance policy, but when you go down and you actually study having a diverse community of native bees means you have better shaped fruit and better pollination in general. So this has been studied over and over again in many, many different systems, including blueberry, watermelon, strawberry. Having native bees can really increase the quality of your yield in addition to the weight of your yield. In terms of climate change, having a lot of species in a system means that system is more resilient to change. So as we're going through climate change, if there's like a drought in the middle of the summer, and we have lots and lots of species of bees, some that are only out flying in the spring and some that are only out flying in the fall, those ones won't be as impacted by this drought in the summer or in July or whatever. So having lots of different species in there helps us make sure that we have bees out there pollinating not only our food, but also native plants and trees and shrubs that other birds and other small mammals require for food. It's also something really visual. So people can see climate change happening when they're observing plants and bees. They can see flowers blooming and bees not coming to them. They can see flowers about to bloom and then getting iced over. So it really helps us have these conversations around climate change that and allows us to reach people who otherwise maybe would be harder to talk to. And climate change is actually one of the main threats to bees. So I mentioned that most people think the loss of flowers and pesticides are the main threats to bees that are in decline, but it's actually not quite true. Other things to think about, if we want to conserve bees for food security and indigenous sovereignty, that's also important issues that's not talked about as much. People who do have beehives, generally, they require space and time and money. It's not something that everybody can do. Many people just want to be able to plant a vegetable garden and count on wild bees to do the pollination. They don't have the space, time, and money to have their own pollinators. So these tend to be community gardens, often in lower socioeconomic areas in cities or areas that are really highly densely populated. And if you bring in a honeybee hive to maybe pollinate that community garden or whatever, it's possible that by doing so, you can displace or reduce the bee communities over time. Many of the culturally important indigenous medicine and food plants have co-evolved relationships with our native pollinators, thousands and thousands of species of native pollinators. So we still don't really have a good understanding around how bee declines for species that are at risk of extinction, how that will impact these relationships. So I mentioned this already, but in the world, we have over 20,000 species of bees and over 860 in Canada. In the Greater Toronto area, there's around 350. In Ontario, there's over 400. And we're describing these species all the time. This one was actually found in downtown Toronto in the annex. It was a newly described species to science. So we're still learning about the different species that we have, and there's a lot of them. So here's just some pictures of some of the major groups, just so you can start looking around and noticing some of the diversity that you might have around you. Leafcutter bees are distinctive because their legs are too busy carrying these little pieces of leaves that they use to wrap up their baby bees inside twigs. So they actually carry pollen on their abdomens, not on their legs. So if you see that, then you'll know you're looking at some sort of leafcutter bee. Mining bees, they're the ones that make these holes in sort of sandy soils. And there'll be just a female protecting her eggs. So these are all solitary bees. 3/4 of our bees are solitary bees. This is a really, really large group. These are among some of the earliest to emerge in April. and some of the most important pollinators for fruit trees like apple trees and cherry trees, those early blooming trees. They often, because they like sandy soil, they're often found in playgrounds as well. So I've been working with the city of Toronto to put signage just to start educating people, because they probably think that they're dangerous or that they're wasps, but yeah, if you leave them alone, they're fine. Sweat bees, this is the largest, most diverse group of bees. We're almost, I don't even know, we have hundreds and hundreds of species of sweat bees. And they tend to be mostly metallic-y green or metallic-y silver. And yeah, these are among the most common. And they're called sweat bees because sometimes some of the species will land on you and lick your sweat. So when you think about what we were taught about bees, it actually doesn't represent at all what we know, what bees actually are. So most of our bees live in the ground. Most of our bees cannot sting. Most of our bees are solitary. They don't live in hives. There's a bunch of different colors. We have blue bees, green bees, orange bees, silver bees. They're not these yellow and black striped things that we always see in cartoons. And actually none of our native bees make honey. So the European honeybee makes honey because they store food for the winter and the whole hive stays awake for the winter. So they need to have that food. But our native bees actually all sleep for the winter like bears do or what have you. So they don't require those extra resources from the environment to stay awake over the winter time. And when you hear things about overwintering losses, that's kind of some like, part of that is because these honeybees have not evolved in Canadian winters. They're, from Mediterranean regions of Europe and more regions of Asia and Africa as well. Oh, this is sort of out of order here, but sorry, another group of bees that you're probably familiar with. We have the large carpenter bees, Ilocopa. They do drill into wood, but bees actually reuse the nests over and over again. So I haven't actually seen any sort of major damage caused by carpenter bees. They're not like carpenter ants. And then there's something called small carpenter bees, and they mostly live inside raspberry canes. So one of the things when people are talking about like not throwing out your spring debris or what have you, it's because many bees not only nest inside these twigs, but they also develop and overwinter inside twigs as well. And raspberry is one of the main ones. So in terms of bee declines, it talks a lot about the different types of bees and that honeybees are not in decline, but what do we know about the bees that are actually in decline? So I work on bumblebees. It's one of the most easy to identify groups of the different bees. There's about 250 species of bumblebees globally and just under 50 in North America. They're cold weather animals. They're actually more diverse in colder temperate areas like the Pyrenees, the Alps, Mongolia, in Canada and Western along the Rockies. They're quite large and colorful. People have a fondness towards them. There's lots of records of them in museums because people have been collecting them or interested in them for many, many years. You pretty much can find them anywhere where there's a long, predictable winter, and they like open, flower-rich habitats. And they're one of our few species that actually do have colonies. This is what a colony looks like. So right now, depending on the species, some have already gone to sleep. Some are looking for overwintering sites. So these large females will sleep over the fall and winter and come out in the springtime. When that is depends on the species. Some of our species come out in April, some come out in May, some come out in June. Really depends. So once those females come out, they'll find a nest site. And for some species, a nest site is an abandoned rodent burrow. For some species, a nest site is tall grass from last year. Some are really adaptable and will live under your shed or at the base of your garage. I had someone leave a gym bag out and the queen started a colony inside their sweatshirt. So it really depends on the species. Some are more flexible than others. So when she finds a nest site, She will go out and forage and collect a pollen ball and make a nectar cup and then start laying eggs. And once the eggs hatch, then the workers take over all of the work in the colony, and the queen just continues just to lay eggs and grow the colony over the summertime. So at some point, the queen decides to switch and she makes new queens and males and no more workers. And that depends again on the species. So some are done at the middle of June, some are continue on until October. Really depends. And these males and new queens go out, they mate, and then the mated queens sleep for the winter and everyone else in the colony dies. So I worked with colleagues on this identification guide, Bumblebees in North America, which you can find in most major bookstores. And in order to do this, we needed to make range maps. So we went to many museum collections and collected data, which we were also able to use to assess species declines using the IUCN Red List assessment. So we looked at all the North American species, and we found that about 1 in 4 are at risk of extinction. So this is not quite the same as what many thought, which is that all bees are endangered. It's not the greatest news because some species are critically endangered in that they decline by more than 70% in less than a couple decades. Some are declining sort of more slowly, and we do have some species that are quite common and don't seem to show any sort of evidence of decline. And then we also have 5 species that are data deficient. Those are the ones that are up north, and we just don't have good recent or historical data to understand what's going on with them. So these are some of the images from the maps that sort of illustrate what's going on here. So the rusty patch bumblebee is one that I've been focused on for a long time now. It was one of the most common species in Southern Ontario in the 70s and 80s and maybe even the early 90s. And then it completely collapsed from most of the eastern parts of its range. These white squares are sort of more where it's recently found. So it's still found in the Midwest. It's still found in pockets in Minnesota and Wisconsin and Illinois. But it's pretty much disappeared from the Smoky Mountains, the Appalachians, all of Southern Ontario. The single dot here for Southern Ontario is Pinery Provincial Park. It's somewhere where I have found it in 2005 and 2009, and those are both the last known records for Canada for the species. Whereas if you were looking at 100 bees and bumblebees in the 70s or 80s, 15 of them would have been the species. So this is a massive decline over protected areas, but it was also found in cities. I have records of it from downtown Toronto, from Guelph, all sorts of places. So this is a very generalist adaptable species that nested and foraged in all sorts of different habitat. So this pattern of decline can really only be explained by an introduction of disease. And we think it was probably from a managed bee industry that caused it to decline. And there's still some populations hanging on, but it was a really massive decline over a short period of time. This one is called Bombus Pensylvanicus, or the American bumblebee. This one is one of the ones that is sort of declining more slowly, not that drastic drop over a few decades. This one we can still find and we can still work on in Southern Ontario. It has declined by a lot in terms of relative abundance, but we still find it in most parts of its range. So we can learn more about it and figure out how we can help it. And then we have species that seem to be doing well. So often when I say that I, study the conservation of bumblebees, people are like, "Oh, come to my yard. I have lots and lots of bumblebees there." So I'm more interested in species diversity, not so much really, really common species. And it's kind of the same if you were like talking to an ornithologist and you were like, "Oh, just come over to my backyard. I have a million pigeons there," or whatever. So the Comet Eastern bumblebee is exactly that. It is common. And it is native, so that's good. But it's actually increased in abundance and in its range. It's now found in the eastern provinces where previously it was not found there. It's now one of the most common species in Algonquin, where previously it was not there either. So we don't know if it's filling up in range because other species are declining, or if it's because people are using it to pollinate greenhouses or field crops and it's escaping. But this is one of the species that came out as not at risk of extinction. So the next thing my lab is focused on is trying to figure out why some bees are in decline and not all bees, and what the at-risk species need to protect them. So these are kind of the main things that people talk about when we talk about threats to bees. Pathogen spillover. Now that we're living in COVID times, it's a lot easier to explain how devastating this can be. It's a threat that people don't really take seriously. And in fact, some of the measures that people think they're helping with, which is like introducing more managed honeybee hives, are actually making this top threat worse. So people think they're helping, but they're actually not helping at all. So an introduced disease into a population that has not co-evolved with that disease and has no defenses can be very dramatic. It can cause dramatic decline. So we've seen it with fish, we've seen it with Serengeti lions, we've seen it with birds. This happens over and over again. So it's something that we consider one of the main threats. For bumblebees in particular, climate change is a big deal. They are cold weather animals. They require building of resources all the way from the springtime or early summer all the way into the fall in order to produce that next generation. So they don't store a lot of food, so they need to have access to flowers without some of these like storms or drought events. So it really does seem like climate change is one of the main threats to bumblebees that are at risk as well. Invasive species, whether that's other invasive bees or plants that might be taking over habitat. Pesticide use like neonics definitely kill bees. They're designed to kill insects, so it's not surprising that they kill bees too. But it is quite a localized threat in a lot of cases. A cornfield that's sprayed with a different type of pesticide versus a cornfield that uses neonics versus a cornfield that doesn't use any pesticides are still not great habitats for wild bees anyway. Not that I'm saying that we should use more pesticides or anything, it's just that the pesticide risk has really been more of an issue for beekeepers who are bringing their honeybees into really degraded landscapes. And then they have lost their honeybees because they're exposed to these pesticides, which are very, very dangerous to insects. Well, I mean, they're designed to do that. And then habitat loss. So many of our insect species are quite adaptable. They'll use all sorts of different flowers, hundreds of different flowers, whether it's native or non-native. Some of our native bee species are specialists on things like goldenrod or sunflowers or evening primrose. We have one species of bees that specializes in spring beauty in the spring, and that's it. So we do have specialist bees as well. So that's where habitat loss really does come into play. For bumblebees, they need a lot of forage, but then they also need overwintering habitat and nesting habitat. So planting flowers doesn't really cover all of their habitat needs. They also need those other things as well. So those are all kind of the main things that people talk about. So one of my recently graduated PhD students, Amanda, studied 2 at-risk bumblebee species, so the ones that we know to be at risk of decline, trying to figure out what kind of habitats they would need so that we could try to support them by managing lands in ways that would support specifically the at-risk bumblebees. And even though both of these species occur in Southern Ontario and they look very similar, what she found is that they require very different habitats. So Bombus turcola, the yellow-banded bumblebee, was more associated with wetlands, with early emerging flowers, early blooming flowers, forests, and yeah. Bombus pensylvanicus, the American bumblebee, was more associated with later blooming plants like thistle and goldenrod and cowvetch and more open areas, grasslands, farmlands, that kind of thing. So this is just sort of looping back to what I was mentioning before, that all bees don't require the same thing, and actually we need to learn a lot about them and if we're going to protect the ones that are going extinct. So now that we have some data, some information, we can really be more selective about how we plant for bees. We can target species at the edges of their ranges to help them with climate change. We can increase food availability. Those fields of goldenrod that everyone seems to vilify are actually such important food sources for all of our insects that are getting ready to sleep over the winter. It's how they build their fat bodies. That is their energy source for while they're sleeping. And focusing just on pesticides, vilifying just one type of threat or one type of habitat is really not that useful if the goal is to support at-risk species. So how can you help? The number one way that people can help is to submit photos to Bumblebee Watch. We have found lots of populations of rare species. We're tracking invasive species, how they're moving. We're learning about which plants bees need, where they're nesting, all sorts of things. We've used this data in many scientific papers. We've used it for expert testimony to the government. It's a free phone app, or you can use the website if you have a camera and you just want to upload pictures directly from the camera. So anyway, when people ask me what's the number one thing to do for bees, this is it: sending in pictures of bumblebees to help us build our data sets. And then the other thing is to talk to people about bee diversity. Often people think wasps are bees and they just think of them as really pesty things, or if they do know about bees, they think about carpenter bees or honeybees, and they don't really know about the vast diversity of bees that we have and how important all these different bee species are for resilience and for pollination. And if you're focused on planting native plants, well, plant native plants, but especially consider early flowering trees and shrubs. Often when people think about pollinator gardens or whatever, you miss the shoulder seasons, the spring and the fall, and those are very important points. The spring is when the females are coming out after sleeping all winter and they're on the verge of starvation, so they really need early food sources. Or in the fall is when they're building up to be able to either migrate in the case of monarch, or to sleep over winter is the case of our native bees. If you Google the flower patch or the rusty patch, and I'll put a link in the chat in a second, I have a couple of resources. So these are based on museum records for the rusty patch bumblebee, but lots of native bees will feed off of these things. And we kind of showed what it looks like if you were to plant a garden that covers the bloom season. So all the way from the spring to the fall. So we have this PDF online, and then I have a bigger guide that I'll paste in a second. So creating pollinator habitat is good. It's better than lawns, but really protecting and restoring high quality habitat where we have that high diversity of native bees and they've been there for a long time. That's really important as well. And I'm sure something that you're all passionate about being a part of this group. I'm also encouraging people to think about pollinator gardens in different ways. And I think community gardens for growing food is one of those ways that needs to be considered more, because it allows you to have conversations with your neighbors about food and pollination and observe bees together, and also like recognize that connection that we have with the processes, that the wildlife that are sort of surrounding our areas. And then to think about the larger systemic issues causing climate change, causing disease proliferation, that kind of thing, to think sort of the broader picture. So my friend Charlotte DeKaiser has a website called beewashing.com, and she has lots of examples of where people are just misinforming people about bees in general. A lot of stuff about, even here, Sierra Club saying honeybees are endangered. So Sierra Club is like a US-based organization. So to say that an invasive non-native species is endangered and celebrated on Endangered Species Days, when there's so many other species that are actually endangered and native, just doesn't make any sense. Installing beehives on roofs in areas that are very degraded in terms of habitat anyway is seen as a sustainability initiative, which doesn't make any sense when you really think about it. It's kind of like throwing 1 million carp into Lake Ontario and saying that you're helping the fish. It just it doesn't make any sense. So there's a lot of bee washing that goes on. It's hard to sort of undo some of the learning. And then more frequently, people have been talking a lot about simple solutions. So things like no mow May, growing the dandelions for bees. So in terms of the weeds, like dandelions and white clover are better, obviously, than grass. But they're not native plants, and they probably benefit non-native bees more than they benefit native bees. But also, people have lawn for a reason. They want a place to walk. And the number one way that people tell me that they get stung by bee is walking barefoot or with sandals in a grass with white clover. So I'm much more of a proponent of, if you want grass or lawn, to have it, and then to use your borders and really put some dense native flowering plants along the borders, because you can get way more diversity of native plants that way. And you can have things that bloom at different parts of the year instead of just having these weeds that, help probably the weedy species of bees, so not the like more specialized ones, and they mostly help the bees in the middle of the season, not the early or late season, and all of this stuff. So anyway, just beware of simple solutions, because our ecological integrity depends on all of these processes that have co-evolved over millions and millions of years, and humans just don't fully understand them. So we can't just say something like, let your dandelions go and we're going to save all the bees, or wait until you have 3 days of 10-degree weather and you can like clean up all of your leaf litter and you'll save all of the bees or whatever. These things don't make any sense. It's much more complicated than that. So with that, I will end and take any questions that you might
have. Okay, thank you so much, Sheila. We do have a few questions. I'm going to start in the Q&A box. And if people have some more questions, they are welcome to put it in. Hopefully we can get to everybody's. But if we don't, you can always send me an email, reply to the emails that I sent you as reminders with some more questions. We can try to get those answered later as well. Okay, so Sheila, if you're ready, I'm going to start with a question from Janet. Her question is, are bumblebees found the furthest north of any bee species? I've heard that bumblebees can generate enough heat to move about by beating their wings, so that the overwintering queens are the earliest bees to be seen, at least in Toronto.
Yeah. So they are able to thermoregulate, which not a lot of other insects can do. So they move their thoracic muscles really high frequencies, and then they can make their bodies warmer than the ambient temperature. And not all insects can do that. Some of them need to wait until the sun warms them up and that kind of thing. So we do have bumblebees up north in the tundra. They have a very short season. Basically their colonies are like, I don't know, 6 workers, whereas our bumblebee hives here will be like 200, just because they have like that really short season where they can grow. But they do forage when it's like still snowing or raining, when it's close to 0 degrees, which is pretty cool. But as you go north, I should say that bumblebees are pollinators, but really flies become the most important pollinators of our sort of Arctic tundra type plants.
That's kind of cool. I never heard of that. Okay, next question. Which tree species is best to get as many native bees fed in early spring? Willow, maybe?
Yeah, so pussy willows willow trees are the best. Probably pussy willows are the best. Easter redbud is also a really, really good one. But yeah, anything that blooms really early. I think serviceberry blooms pretty early as well. And then any kind of like fruit tree, really. A cherry apple, I know a lot of them aren't native, but yeah, those are also really important forage. So yeah, so people say like, oh, I'm not seeing any bees in the springtime, but that's because sometimes you have to look up and you'll have like a weeping willow tree and the bees will be up there foraging on the pollen. You just like don't know to look up to see where they are.
Okay. All right. Next question, is having water available important for bees? I read somewhere that you should keep water with pebbles in it so it's shallow and they can walk and don't drown. I did it this year and found that they used it immediately and a lot. I also found that I had almost no drowned bees or wasps in my pool.
Yeah, so water, I think only bees need water, and then the wasps that make like the paper nest, because they need to like mix the like wood that they chew with water, or even the mud dauber wasps that use mud. But all of our native bees, as far as I know, don't need water. They don't collect water.
Okay. Okay, next question from Brenda. I have lots of native plants and lots of different bees. However, this year I'm seeing many more honeybees, and I think someone near us is put in a hive. Is there any way to discourage them in favor of the native bees?
To discourage the bees in your property, probably not. I think if you keep planting native plants, that would help. But in general, the reason why people use honeybees is because they're generalists, and they're really flexible and they'll forage on anything that they can forage on. So unfortunately, that's there's no real way to kind of kick the honeybees out. But I mean, if you do find out who has the beehive close by, a lot of the times people think they're doing something good. So if you can have that conversation and let them know that like beehives are for people, they're not for the environment. And when you get down to like what the intention is, if they want to have their own beehive because they want their own honey, then that's fine. Like there's no other way of getting around that. At least they admit that that's why they're doing it. But a lot of people do have beehives because they think they're helping the wider environment. So they might actually just stop if you have that conversation.
Yeah, it can be a hard conversation to have, but definitely worth it to have with your neighbors. I know I've started doing having conversations with my neighbors, and they tend to be more elderly and like, what do you know about gardening? And I say nothing, but we have a lot of webinars on native bees and native plants. Anyway, it's worth having the conversation for sure. Okay, we have, I think, one more question in our Q&A box. Are bee houses useful? I've seen mud bees at my box.
Yeah, so again, it comes down to intention. So if the goal is to be able to see solitary bees up close and personal, then having a bee condo is how you would do that. If the goal is to try to get more solitary bees into your garden, and maybe that would work for that. None of the bees that use bee condos are species that are at risk of extinction or in decline. They're all sort of more common weedy species. And in fact, non-native solitary bees use bee condos more than native bees do. And when the native bees do use them, they tend to be more highly parasitized, which makes sense because it's basically like a buffet of bees for a parasite to come in, because in nature, they don't nest in aggregates like that, like a bee condo has. So in general, humans are really bad at replicating nature. So if you are trying to support bee nesting, just like keeping your old twigs and keeping things messy is much better than going out and buying a Costco bee condo or whatever.
And cheaper for you, for everyone. Okay, and then, let's check. Okay, one more question here. Most properties, except for rooftops in Toronto, cannot have beehives due to municipal bylaws set back from property lines. Have you ever heard of anyone being charged for an infraction?
I have not, and that would be a really interesting thing to ask. There's only one apiarist for the province of Ontario who kind of enforces this kind of thing, so he's probably super overwhelmed. But also I heard that the property line thing doesn't, like, if you're talking about horizontal distance, then that comes into play as well. So having, I don't know. So it's not just like a two-dimensional thing. It might also be a three-dimensional thing. But yeah, in general, like it seems like beehives have been allowed like absolutely everywhere. There's almost no regulation around it, unfortunately.
Yeah, I can imagine they would be overwhelmed at that point. Looks like someone's saying Brampton allows one beehive if you have enough clearance. So it's kind of like that three-dimensional thing that you were talking about, probably. Okay, and there was a question, sorry, not for Sheila, but just for us to repeat the information about the volunteer planting on October 2nd and 3rd. So that is going to be in Schaumburg, pretty much at like Highway 27 and Highway 9. We have 2 properties, so one's being done one day and one's being done the next day. They're both private nature reserves, so people don't just get to go on them except for like a specific event or volunteer. And I will be sending out a thank you email to everybody after this webinar, most likely today or the beginning of next week, and it'll have some information about that. But if you're eager, you can just head to our website under workshops and events. We have a page for workshops and events, and it's listed there as well. So hopefully that helps answer your question, but definitely more information to come if you're interested. And we would just be so grateful because we don't have many people signed up right now, and we have a lot of plans to get through. So
I just put in the chat, the first one is sort of our guide, the planting guide. It's a booklet that we don't have hard copies, but you can download the whole thing. It's like, I don't know, like 100 pages or something. The Bumble Bee guide. So that one was free, the first one, the Earth Canada one, and then the Bumble Bees of North America you can buy from any bookstore. I think Chapters has it as well. I just took the first link, which was Amazon, and then our free citizen science project is Bumblebee Watch, and it's also a free phone app as well.
Okay, awesome. And all right, so it looks like we're getting some thank yous. And no other questions coming in. This is everyone's last chance for questions before we let Sheila go. So I think we're okay. Well, thank you so much, Sheila. It was great to meet you over the screen. I think this is the first time you've worked with us, but hopefully it'll be some more times in the future. And thank you to everybody who attended. I think I mentioned in the email, but you know, the numbers that we can show that attended our events and enjoyed and learned from our events, that really helps us continue to do things, adds to our conservation efforts. So it helps people see that they should sponsor us and things like that. We are we do our work based off donations and grants. So every single person who came tonight, just by coming, you've helped us a lot. So thank you so much. And I hope everybody has a great night. All right, bye everybody.